Hi, guys. Welcome to week 2 of environmental law. Today, we are going to be talking about the history of environmental law, talking in detail about the standing concept, environmental justice, environmental racism, concepts of risk management and work safety, um, and then some of the environmental organizations that have cropped up throughout the years. So, um, we talked about this last week, but one of the big impetuses for environmental regulation was this little book by Rachel Carson called Silent Spring. And it talked about pesticides and how, and she was a naturalist, kind of a biologist, I think. And she just noticed that since these pesticides were being used, um, the environment started changing. Maybe fewer birds, maybe rivers look different. And she just wrote in a very simple book about, what the world is looking like. So people read this book, and it was easy to read and it was quick to read. And they started thinking about the industrial actions and their impacts on the environment. Um, I have posted for you under our activities for this week. I have a PDF of Silent Spring, which I really recommend if you're interested in environmental law or just environmental issues at all. Take a gander because as I said, it's simple, it's quick to read. Um, but uh, it's very powerful. So yeah, we stand now where two roads diverge. This is the last chapter. They're not equally fair. The choice is ours to make. Um, we can't control nature, all that stuff. I mean, it's pretty big concepts, but really, really, really powerful. Okay, so another big thing that happened in the 60s was this lawsuit, the Scenic Hudson lawsuit. So this is Storm King Mountain in New York State, up by Hunter Mountain. I'm not Hunter Mountain, up by West Point, and they wanted to build the Federal Power Commission wanted to build a hydroelectric power plant there, right? So it was the tallest mountain in the area. It's very pretty. They called it Storm King because it was higher up, so clouds formed there first, and it looked like the storms were coming from there. So in Scenic Hudson, there was a proposed hydroelectric plant that was approved by the Federal Power Commission. Okay, so the Federal Power Commission is this agency. So the agencies are the ones that later on became obliged to kind of complete some environmental protections before acting, but this was even before that. So the question was, so they approved the building of this hydroelectric plant, but did they properly discharge its duty to improve or develop the waterway under the Federal Power Act? So again, actions of the agency we talked about. They're delegated. It's delegated powers. So the power for the agency action came from the Federal Power Act. So the other question is, did the plaintiffs who are suing to block this building of the hydroelectric plant, did they have standing under this Federal Power Act to even file a lawsuit to dispute the decision of the Federal Power Act? Okay, so standing, the definition of standing is the legal right of a person or an organization to sue. Okay, so if you're in a car accident, I can't sue the driver of the other car, right? I don't have the legal right to sue unless, say I'm your parent and I have I can sue in your behalf. So The rules, the statute that we're looking at, the derivative power for the agency is the Federal Power Act. And that requires that any prospective project must be, this is the term from the statute, best adapted to a comprehensive plan for improving or developing a waterway. Okay. And then for parties to have standing, they must be, here it is, aggrieved by an order issued by the commission. Okay, so anyone who is aggrieved, so that's the standard to find out if these parties are agreed. So on the two issues, was this the best adapted of the waterway? Since we're on a waterway, we're on the Hudson River here. The commission, just like in the case we looked at last week, which is totally not. Oh, that was the one about the park in Tennessee. See, my brain will work at some point. Um, the issue we worked out last week, same thing. They didn't compile the record. Okay, so they didn't, even if they looked at these reasonable alternatives, they didn't compile the record. Okay, so they didn't compile a record to support that this was the best adaptation of or use of the waterway. And there was no, even if they did study alternatives, there's nothing that showed that they studied alternatives. Okay, so that's what the court found. On the standing issue, they're trying to figure out what does aggrieved mean. Okay, it doesn't mean economic injury. They said no, you don't have to. So the people who are suing are these citizens. So just a citizen group, right? So yeah, they call it the Scenic Hudson Preservation Conference. Okay, so there's no need for, so the court finds that there's no need for economic injury. Supreme Court has not made economic injury a prerequisite to standing if there is what they call a direct personal interest. Okay, and the act itself gives petitioners a legal right to protect their interests. So these petitioners, the Scenic Hudson Commission, they used the trails. They were residents of the town, so there were economic interests of the people who lived nearby. And one of the reasons that the Power Commission was saying, oh, well, you can't just give citizen groups powers because then there'll be thousands of future interveners. And the court says, I don't care. It comes from the statute, not from me. They say we seek no justification for the commission fears that our determination will encourage thousands to intervene and seek review in the future. They believe that no such horrendous possibility exists, and the court's experience with public actions confirms the view that the expense and vexation of legal proceedings is not lightly undertaken, right? Because it is expensive to file a suit. So no rando is going to just file a suit unless they've really given it a good think. Okay, so, and the issue of the planning, right? The best adapted thing. The court is not requiring that they compile a record. The statute is, right? That comes from Congress. They didn't look at an alternative power source like gas turbines. There's no record that they looked at the overall public interest, and there's no record that they looked into the consideration of the fish population. Okay, so they concluded yes, that the parties do have standing. They do not need personal economic injury to be considered aggrieved. They only have to have a direct personal interest. So the parties in this commission have to, be residents of the area, using the trails, using this parkland. That is the only requirement. So they kicked this case back to the commission to make further findings on whether they did enough research and whether the project was in the overall public interest. Okay, so we really just talked about it. So the court determined that the parties were aggrieved because they were the people who used these lands, and if it was all of a sudden a hydroelectric plant, they couldn't enjoy the views, enjoy the hiking. If they lived nearby, there could be economic injury to the citizen group. Their property values might go down if they're, have a nice view of a mountain and then all of a sudden it's a power plant. It's not as pretty. So your property values go down. And what should the commission should have done? They should have looked at alternatives to a hydroelectric plant. They should have looked into the overall public interest of building a hydroelectric plant, and they should have looked at environmental kind of impacts, like what's this going to do to the fish and the wildlife in the area. All right, so now we're going to go through the environmental law kind of decade by decade. So in the 1970s, that was really the origin of environmental law as a concept, an area of practice. Okay, the first big act, right? January 1st, 1970 is the National Environmental Policy Act, which we'll talk about in detail next week. We first had environmental groups like this, say this Citizens to Commission for Scenic Hudson or the Sierra Club. They used these environmental statutes to litigate environmental issues to really create what is now environmental law. They call it environmental activism, and that's still kind of going on today and gets more important as we go through the decades. The court started defining what standing means in an environmental case, or what standard of review the courts will impose on an agency decision. So that's the 70s. 1980s had, thinking about different things with environmental law. Issues of environmental elitism or environmental racism and environmental justice kind of emerged. And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But, companies ran factories, maybe dumped, maybe polluted, made a lot of money. And these factories were located in poor areas. So the results of this dumping and these factories, these are the people that were hit hardest, and the residents didn't have the resources to fight these big companies. And the poor areas were often minority groups living there as well. 1980s, we have more of this environmental activism. So this was a book written by Edward Abbey in 1975 called The Monkey Wrench Gang. We all know about, throwing a monkey wrench into something. So this fictional group, they used sabotage to protest what they were thinking were environmentally damaging activities. So monkey wrench, kind of means making it harder for people to do things. And then the Monkey Wrench Gang, inspired one of these radical environmental organizations called Earth First. So this is kind of that was really the Earth First, the Monkey Wrench Gang. They were doing affirmatively sabotaging things. But Greenpeace also came into strong activity in the 1980s, and they used kind of nonviolent creative action to create a more environmentally friendly world. So there was one, this was actually in the 70s, but there was nuclear testing in Alaska, and they did things like just called the press and the TV cameras, and they would just be around like with signs saying, we oppose this, or why are, no nuclear bombs in our, wilderness or something like that. And then I think there was one someplace in Alaska, which but there was one test, and then after that, they stopped doing that, and there were laws preventing it. Um, and then you'll probably maybe be more familiar with Greenpeace. Actually, they have those boats, and they would go around near the whaling boats, the Japanese boats that were whaling, and just generally interfering with them, so making it hard for them to do their job. Um, so to interfere with them, killing the whales. So that was the 1980s. 1990s, I should put little like pictures that show you what the 1990s were like. But in the 1990s, the environmental law became more politicized. Um, it became a campaign issue. So candidates and elected officials kind of said, "Hey, I'm green. I'm not green. I'm pro industry. I'm pro environment," and they were held accountable by their constituents for this. So people decided, people are like, "I'm an environmentalist. I'm. This is important to me." Um, 2000s early, we became more concerned with climate change, eco-terrorism. 2010 on, we're really, it's the big thing everybody's concerned with. Climate change, weather has changed. In the United States, we've had a lot of laws proposed, but none have passed. The EPA is not doing a great job regulating the greenhouse gases. Globalization, they're realizing, every country realizing that it is a worldwide goal um, to stop or reduce the progression of climate change. Um, Kyoto Protocol, the United Nations efforts, the Paris Agreement, which the U.S. was a part of, and then under Trump we got out of, and then now under Biden we're back in. 2020 there was another UN climate summit, and more countries were putting out the goal of zero emissions at some point in the future. Um, Environmentalists are realizing that going to the government and asking for laws to change because of the partisanship of our government right now, and strict party lines, um, they're trying to maybe use the courts to get what they want done, rather than trying to get legislation. Leadership is going through executive orders, right? This is all new. Our Biden environmentalism. Biden ran on a green ticket. He is proposing to reverse a lot of the policies of the prior president. He rejoined the Paris Agreement. Just even his first month, he had at least 2 executive orders putting environmental issues and concerns of climate change at the forefront. I have actually attached both of those executive orders, or 2 of those executive orders, um, to the learning module. Um, and then there in November 21. Oh, this is poorly done here. World, I don't know. I didn't proofread this, I guess. And then in November 21, Biden and others met at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, and they're working to negotiate their goals. In May 2021, Biden created a climate control office. And I mean, this was from like kind of his Wikipedia page, but they're saying that Biden would like zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And then in his infrastructure plan, he is investing in clean energy companies and jobs that will result in more clean energy. This is just a little screenshot of New York Times articles on Biden's recent stuff with environmental law. So infrastructure, EPA. So these are the rules and regs put out by the EPA, putting more tightening their regs related to auto pollution and emissions. He's promising stricter regulation of lead in drinking water, and he's trying to limit methane. So that's just really in the past few months what's going on in the White House on climate change. All right, so that's our history lesson on environmental law, what's going on, and I'm going to try to keep up to date with things that are going on with respect to each of these statutes that we go through, and regulations, because things are changing daily. All right, so environmental justice is a term referring to uh, dumping and things like that, and how they are related to things like racism or poverty discrimination. Okay, so we talk about like NIMBY syndrome. So everybody wants like progress, everybody wants uh, great things to be built, and we really want things to be built in our country to keep jobs in there. However, nobody wants it in their backyard, right? We call that NIMBY syndrome. Citizens viewing, if there's a big factory that's going to be built, everybody's like, whoa, 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 I don't want that here, right? What is this going to do to my drinking water? What is this going to be doing to the air I breathe? Even like all these Amazon facilities, right? You have all these Amazon facilities, and then you have all these, trucks with emissions, or just crazy Amazon drivers going through there, right? So everybody wants the jobs and everybody wants their Amazon deliveries in a day, but maybe I don't want that factory in my backyard. So that's kind of, it's a common view, right? Nobody wants unattractive things that negatively affect where they live near them. So local governments have started doing things like giving citizens a voice. There will be notices of new construction before permits are issued, and there's a public forum to express their views. Uh, then environmental justice. So that is concerned that a minority and low income populations are traditionally unduly exposed to environmental hazards. And so to avoid that, again, given the opportunity to voice concerns and negotiate reductions in emissions, or negotiate changes in behavior by these corporations who are altering the environment. Environmental racism is the term given to the practice of putting dangerous environmental activities in areas where the populations are largely minority, and they don't have resources to speak out, or even they don't have the knowledge that these activities are going on and the danger of these activities. Environmental elitism, similar, more on like locating these activities in low income areas. A little graphic here, where, look at this, 56% of the population near toxic waste sites are people of color. Can I move you? I can. They have 95% of their claims against polluters denied by the EPA. Higher nitrogen dioxide exposure, more likely to live without good water and modern sanitation. And this is just in our country, it's not worldwide. So one of the earlier examples of, I don't know if you call it environmental elitism, environmental racism, was the Love Canal. And you guys are probably all too young to remember when this was happening, but it was a big news item. So this is upstate New York, like by Niagara Falls. And this entrepreneur, William Love, had a dream of creating this power canal project. And then it never happened. So he abandoned it in like 1910. And so this was kind of just unused property. And then Hooker Electrochemical Company used this property as a toxic dump for chemical waste. So they're just putting all their waste there in this canal. So in 1953, they just backfilled the canal with topsoil or whatever, and they sold it to the Niagara Falls School Board for $1. Um, and so this area which was a toxic waste dump was the site of an elementary school. Okay, and then the area and became a residential working class neighborhood, right? So there were just nice middle class houses there, and a lot of African Americans living there. And residents, they didn't know this whole, the school board and the neighborhood came up. They didn't know that it was built on the top of a toxic dump. And for years and years, people who lived there, they noticed smells like disgusting stuff in their yards, black ooze. And then in 1978, there was a big rainstorm, and the barrels were started, like when the soil was washed away, barrels were emerging. And then they did some research, and they figured out what happened. And there was toxic chemicals in the soil and the groundwater. People were sick. The country was shocked that this happened, that this Hooker Chemicals just like pawned off this property, knowing what was there and knowing that people were going to live there and kids were going to go to school there. The federal government did come in to clean up, and this was kind of the beginning of the inspiration for the CERCLA Act, which is, requires companies to clean up their own messes. Another example is, if you've seen Erin Brockovich, you might remember this in Hinckley, California. Pacific Gas and Electric, they dumped hexavalent chromium into the groundwater for a long period of time. And then this stuff, it was put into these unlined ponds, and then it got into the groundwater. The PG&E knew about the contamination, but they didn't let anybody know until 1987. And then in 1993, a paralegal, Erin Brockovich, investigated this cluster of illnesses in the community, and people were signing releases and getting settlements from PG&E, and they didn't even know why. But she was the one who kind of did all the research, and they got damages of $400 million. And it was the largest settlement of a class action lawsuit in U.S. history. And just pop culture aside, the lawyer, later married someone who became a Real Housewife. So what's her name? Erica Jane. This is her husband, who now they're divorcing, and he's in dementia care. But anyway, I digress. So that is the Hinckley, California example. Other examples of environmental elitism: Anniston, Alabama. The Monsanto chemical processing site was dumping PCBs. Those are, we'll talk about them later, but it's kind of like the oils that are used to lubricate engines. And they released these into the water and land for years. They were 100% banned in 1979 because of they were severely carcinogenic. The residents who lived there were economically challenged. They grew food in this soil, and then people were sick. Got sick. Oh my gosh, look at all these typos. 3,500 plaintiffs, and the really terrible thing is that the executives knew this was happening. They knew that people were getting sick, and they continued to do this, and just kind of betting that people aren't going to sue them. Really sad. So the class action remedy, something that's big in environmental law. It gives, people can band together and get a louder voice. And compensation proposals included, compensating individuals as well as, requiring cleanup of the area. Another hot term, it's on the quiz, is LULU, which is, they call that, it's an acronym for locally undesirable land use. Okay, so nobody wants a LULU in their backyard. Here it is. And if there is going to be a LULU, there's a movement towards giving, having open hearings, giving citizens a louder voice on where a potentially hazardous facility is going to be located. They come up with things. If you're going to allow a LULU, they, promise mitigation measures, where the dumping is going to go, how it's reducing emissions, things like that. If a community suffers harm, they might have it built-in remedies. And if it looks like the siting choice is based on racial discrimination, they examine that beforehand. The intention is to reduce community opposition, let them know what's going on, but also it reduces their liability. So if they have built-in remedies, that limits the remedies if they do something wrong. So that helps them too, and then maybe lessen the burden on the community with those compensation proposals. Some cases, and this is just kind of bad news for people who are trying to claim discriminatory practices, environmental racism. It's really hard to do, and you can claim it, but there's really no legal cause of action for environmental racism. So one case, East Bibb Twigs versus Macon County. Residents claimed that the landfill placement was racially motivated, but the court said they don't have insufficient evidence to support that they were putting it there with intent to discriminate, or that there was a proportionally discriminatory impact. So unsuccessful claim of environmental racism there. Same thing. Groups started trying to bring cases under the Civil Rights Act for environmental actions. Alexander versus Sandoval said, nope, no private cause of action under a statute, under Civil Rights Act, unless it was expressly provided for. And then, this is 1993. Camden Citizens Action, same thing. No Section 83 cause of action for environmental racism. So it's not. You can accuse somebody of it, and you can try to change practices, but there is no legal cause of action at this current time for that kind of theory. NEPA, which we'll talk about next week in more detail, in July 1996 came up with reforms to implement environmental justice goals. They require that an agency must analyze environmental effects on minority and low-income communities. Mitigation measures should address the effects on minority and low-income communities, and federal agencies must provide for community output. All right, so I'm going to take a break here because I've been chatting a while, and I'll put this video into a couple of pieces.